Yeah, okay, so we are recording, and welcome everybody to this special talk. And the theme of today's talk is going to be the Palani Hills Sky Islands, and it's a personal journey, rethinking landscape, ecology, change in the hills, and change in the hills that we love. This is really, it's a personal story, and so many of you know me. When I looked out at the audience, there's people that either know me or my parents, sometimes my grandparents. And I hope some of you, I've got you in the slides here to sort of amuse you as we go through. So yeah, a word of thanks. First of all, this is really Paul Vanderardy's initiative on behalf of KFI, and I'm really happy that he's given us this opportunity. So the first thing I need to talk about a little bit is my family, right? And so many of you are actually in the audience and whatnot, but that really forms sort of the whole storyline. And without me telling this story, I can't really tell you about Sky Islands. So, you know, I had grandparents. This is on my father's side, my grandfather Edson and grandmother Dorothy in Kodi. They came out to Madurai in the late 1920s. And of course, later on ended up in Sri Lanka, but they fell in love with Kodi, going up there and spending time their summer holidays up there. And at the time, they did a lot of hiking. Hiking was a key part of what everybody did in those days. Of course, this was an age before even electricity. And in the 1920s, I think you had to walk up there. I can't remember when the Ghat Road was made. Maybe it was just been made. But I mean, walking and going out hiking was a big part of the whole Kodi experience. And we've been able to dig up some of the family pictures. These are pictures. That's my grandfather, I think, over on the left with his camera bag over there. And this is up on PERUMAL Peak. And you can see by the shadow that it is early in the morning. And back then, that's what people did. They would, if you look at the early guidebooks, they talk about how to walk to PERUMAL Peak from Kodi in such a way that you could get there for dawn and watch the sunrise. And it's amazing that lots of people used to do that. And of course, nowadays you need to get special permission, and it's difficult. People don't go there much anymore. But anyways, fast forward ahead. So my parents, of course, were one of the first sort of alumni couples to get married. There's others, some of you in the audience, like Dave and Loie and Miggy and Ed, also were alumni couples. But my parents, Merrick, Lockwood, and Sarah Ann Emerson, were married in 1969. In Charlottesville. They wanted it to be in Kodi, but there's a long story there. It ended up being in Charlottesville. And very soon after, my parents moved to India. They were living in Mysore, and one of the things they did then was they used to take me, this is before I had siblings, up to Kodi. I was very young, and we went to places like Loving Stream. And here's, some of you will recognize the Halva Man, and you will recognize maybe the location on the way up to Jaffna House. And that's how I first got to know Kodi, carried on my father's back, right? Okay, now, one of the things that was really important in our family was this idea of documenting, and I think that's a Lockwood thing. So if you ask my uncle Michael or you talk to Anna, my cousin, this comes through the Lockwood genes, and probably goes back to Edson Lockwood and maybe before that. But one of the things my dad was doing in the early 70s when I was just a baby was he was out photographing some of these landscapes with a 4x5 graphic view camera. And this is actually on Priest Walk. It's an amazing picture. I'm assuming my mother must have taken this picture. And it's out early morning on Priest Walk, and there's one of the priests. We always talk about Priest Walk in terms of the priest, but most of us have never actually met the priest. This was one of the priests that was actually out there maintaining that path as they walked from Pambarpuram down to Shambhaganur. Well, then fast forward ahead, as a kid growing up, we got to go out quite a bit, and this was on an early hike down to Kukal. And as you can see, it's a dry season. It's probably, I think, about April 1981. And I had picked up a bison skull, and the only way that I was allowed to keep it was that if I agreed to carry it back from Kukal Caves. So I did, and it was a big feat at that time for me. The interesting things, some of you who know, like James, and some of you that know ERAVIKULAM, you will look in the back and you can see Anamudi Peak right over here and Katumalai. These are the mountains of ERAVIKULAM in Kerala. at that age, I had no idea what I was looking at. This is Montane Valley over here. But later on, these areas would become very significant to me. And here I am also with my brother Brian, and we're exploring on a hike down to Gundar, I think. And you can see right here, the landscape, you can see things starting to change. This is the first crop of pine trees coming in here, being put in some of these grasslands, but there's still quite a bit of grasslands left in the back. Well, I arrived in KIS in 1978, and some of you will remember that time. It was a significant period because the school was basically transforming. So my parents had been at school in the 1950s and 1960s. They were the children of missionaries. By the time I came, it was transforming itself, and it was becoming an international school. And it was well on its way to, to adopting the IB curriculum. Now, of course, so that was an interesting time, and the demography also of the school was changing, right? So it was going from being very American to being more international. Eventually, it become more South Asian, and I got to witness all of that in my time there. And I came at when I arrived, my parents were living in Bangladesh, and I went to boarding in Lock End, and I went there because my cousins Maria and Anna were there. And my first roommate was Darman Niles, and his sister Radhika is there, and Brian is also with us. And their grandparents had known my grandparents in Jaffna, right, in Sri Lanka. They have Sri Lankan roots. And yeah, so let's go on. So Coady School. At the time also, of course, there were significant alumni that were, that were really inspiring to me, and who we interacted with. And one of them was Ram Whitaker and his wife Zai, and they had sort of really significant impact on me in the sense that I really liked how they had sort of chosen careers that were very unconventional and gone and sort of done things that were sort of more passion based. And I had a chance growing up. We would visit the Croc Bank in Madras. And then I did quite a bit of hiking with Ram up in Coady, usually going trout fishing. And then Zai was also very influential for me in terms of being a writer. And I was, inspired by some of what she had done with her writing. And still to this day, she's a good friend and advises me on my writing. And Ram, I enjoy seeing him whenever I can when I'm down in Madras. You all know that he's become very well known for all his amazing work with snakes and reptiles and conservation. So the 1970s and 80s, right? All of you that, I think almost everybody watching this show will agree that one of the highlights of being in Coady was being able to go hiking. It was really a key part of our whole experience in Coady, right? And the hiking program was there. In fact, one of the things I remember being very young in Coady was that we were not allowed to join the hiking program until we got to be a little bit older. And luckily, my parents came up to Coady enough that I would go out with them. But there were places like Tope back then in those days that we would, walk down to and, go swimming at. I mean, these were amazing places. You can see that this is from the 1980s. You can see the TV tower in the back on that picture. But that's a Lock End group down there, I think about 1986 or 87. But my favorite hikes were, of course, going out with my family because we often went camping. We'd go overnight. And you can see I'm there with my dad. He's wearing chappals. Those of you that know him will smile because he goes everywhere with his chappals, even on the most strenuous hikes. But also notice the Kurinji plants. Now, I don't spend a lot of time in this talk discussing Kurinji plants, but these are the plants that flower every 12 years. And this is 1981. And I think they were about to bloom in 1982 is my calculation. We didn't go and see them in 1982, but here they are coming out in a nice grassland in Kukal. Well, in the 1980s, we continued. Now, some of you will remember tying knots on those wattle trees on the way to Gundar. There's still lots of them out there. And, again, some of our hikes, this is on a hike down to Kukal Cave. Actually, this is about 1986, I think. And our hiking program, of course, we had to have chaperones when we went out. The stories of my father and his generation were they just headed out to the hills. They took 3 people, they told people where they were going, and off they went. We had to have chaperones, which, anyways, well, we adjusted to it. But some of our favorite hikes were, you know, like the camps, and Manjampati was definitely one of our favorite places. And this is important because this becomes, I mean, this is now a tiger reserve. And in India, a tiger reserve is the most important protected area, right? It enjoys the highest level of protection. So back in those days, it was before it had that designation, and Cody School had the permission to walk through it. And that's something, of course, nowadays you can't do. And the truth is probably there's elephants and, you know, other animals like that. You'd have to be rather careful about going into that. But in those days, we were able to walk through that. And this was a special hike we did, led by Ed Tegenfeld, going down to Kukal, camping a night, and then going into Manjampati and then out. Amazing hike that we did. There were some other hikes. There's Bruce Carmen, who was also an important sort of chaperone, went out on a lot of hikes with us. Also Pippa Mukherjee, if you look closely, she's right there. So I started to develop an interest in taking pictures. There wasn't much else that I did in Cody School, but I did do a lot with taking pictures, yearbook work, that kind of thing. And I started learning from my father about sort of, you know, taking pictures, working in the darkroom, that kind of thing. And most importantly, this idea of documenting landscapes. He had been inspired by some of the work of Ansel Adams, and he had, you know, that was his idea of using a large format camera, was to document the landscape in the kind of film that would do justice to the landscape. So we started doing that. And this is, I mean, the last picture is from 1995. And this is I'll be talking about this area in a little bit, but this is in ERAVIKULAM, and that's with my cousin Anna and my dad, and he's holding our panoramic camera, which we used to, you know, really take these large format views of some of these amazing landscapes. Then over those years, after when I had finished college and I was living in Bangladesh, I worked on documenting these stories, but then trying to get them into magazines and get them published. It wasn't to make any money. I certainly didn't make any money from it, but I got a lot of personal joy out of, you know, publishing different stories. And one of the things I enjoyed doing was I did both the pictures, I did the writing, and then later on I started to do my own maps for these stories. And so I started to basically focus on the whole, not just the Palani Hills, but looking at the Western Ghats. And that's kind of important because I think when I was growing up in Cody, we were not aware of the other hill ranges. I remember people going to Uti for sports trips, but we didn't really understand what else was out there, how similar or how different it was. And it was really amazing to come back as an adult and then work on exploring some of these areas. And then over the years, I became a teacher and took up education to support myself. But I kept going back to these places and learning more, writing more, taking more pictures, documenting different things, different aspects of it. One of the key places I went to is ERAVIKULAM, and you saw some pictures of it before. And this is really a significant protected area. And a couple of you, I've got James Zachariah with us, who was the park manager here. And you know, he was one of the key people that helped me sort of understand this landscape. But for the rest of you that understand Cody and the Palani Hills, some of you that lived in the Palanis in the 1940s, the 1950s, this landscape wouldn't have looked too different to you. If you had gone out to Marion Shola or so, it would have looked like this, right? The Palani Hills. And of course that all changed. But in ERAVIKULAM, which is in this Kerala, just to the west of Cody, you have a protected area that is still, you know, the landscape is what it was before. And it's amazing in that way. And this was a particularly nice view of the highest peak in South India. The effort it took for us to get to this place, to be here, was a whole nother story. I could tell you a whole slideshow on it, but it was with my cousin Anna and my dad Merrick. We had a terrific time. It was a frosty morning. We'd woken up and had watched the sunrise. And this is one of those images with the panoramic camera where I've sort of bent it down and it's given you this sort of like, you know, sort of warped view of the earth. But notice the grasslands, right? And the, you know, the undulations and the sholas in the valley. This is classic, you know, Sky Island landscape from the southern Western Ghats. I just put a little picture down here. That's my son, Lenny, in his striped pajama pants. We went there most probably, I think it was about 4 or 5 years ago, we had a chance to visit again, and that is with Shilpa Kumar, the warden later from Silent Valley, then Periyar. And so I've had a nice relationship with our friends over in the Kerala Forest Department, and been able to go to some of these places. And I've also had a chance to participate in some of their studies and some of the censuses and things like that. And it's been a real joy to get to know this area. But basically, these are areas that you can't get to now. So you have to sort of, you know, appreciate them when you see the pictures and whatnot. They're very sensitive areas, so they're pretty much off limits. All right. So let's just talk a little bit about the geography. I'm a geography teacher. That's how I make my living. And I trace it back to Chris Reber, who was my 4th grade teacher. He's the guy that really got me interested in maps and learning about geography. I've met him a couple times, and we always laugh about that. You know, here I am now teaching. But let's talk about the Palani Hills. So the Palani Hills, right, is, if you think about it, is part of the Western Ghats. It is what they call an eastern, sort of a spur of the Western Ghats. And if you look at it, it does look like a spur. And I'm not sure if that's Zai Whitaker that came up with that idea of it being a spur, but it sticks out. In some maps, they don't even want to include it in the Western Ghats, but clearly it is part of it. But notice it is part of this whole wider range, right? So you've got the Palani Hills here over on the east, but you also have, you've got the Annamalai Hills up here in the sort of the northwest of it, and you've also got what's known as the high range. The Annamalais are in Tamil Nadu, just like the Palani Hills. The high range is in Kerala. But all of these mountains basically make up a contiguous landscape. They're one area, so to speak. And one of the interesting things in the last couple of years has been collaborating with people in the Annamalais, in the high range, also in the Nilgiris, which are off this map a little bit to the north, about issues of conservation, issues of restoration, etc. But you know, this is a view that you all know, right? It's the lake basin, and this is a view that you know is sort of dominates. It's the main feature of the Kodaikanal settlement, but these undulating the plateau basically of the hills. That's where the settlement sort of was built up around, and we've got the lake there. Now you're going to see some pictures later on that will look very different than this. But on the edges, on the southern edge, you have these amazing escarpments. So these are big, very dramatic drop-offs. And I'm sure almost everybody in this audience has had some amazing experiences being at places like Pillar Rocks or Doctor's Delight, looking down those edges, imagining different things, and just in awe of this landscape. You also, this is relatively recent. This picture is maybe, I think like 2013 or 16, I can't remember, but notice the grasslands over here. This is called the Agamalai Range. And I remember it mainly because Dr. Tegenfeld would go over there to work with some of the people here. It was very remote, but it still is very remote, and there are still montane grasslands up here. There's also Nilgiri tar up on these spiky peaks here. One of our goals when I was a student was always to go down there and climb these peaks. We haven't done it yet. It's one of my goals to do that. And if you look over here, these hills are over in Bodhi and Thani, and that side, on the other side of the hills. Of course, you know, I'm spending a lot of time talking about landscape, and in this presentation, I'm really not talking about the people or the communities living in the hills. It's just, there's not enough time for me to do that. But these settlements that are up here are really important.
I went to school with him.
The history of the Palani Hills. So this is Pundi, and this is on the northwest slope. And you can, you know, you're looking over actually towards the Annamalai Hills over here.
Mr. Jenks. I used to be scared of him.
Okay, and over here, now this is looking back at Anamudi. Remember the peak that I showed you before, but this is looking from Kukal, from that place. So this is looking at it from Kukal on a really clear winter day, but check out the Sky Island effect, right? Here you are, right? That mist low below it, probably at about 1,800 meters, and then these higher mountains sticking out above it. And it's going to illustrate this idea of the Sky Island, all right? I've chosen to give you really sort of remote places on really beautiful days. It's not always quite this nice, and it's really hard to get to some of these places. But here's one of my favorite places that I think I go back to in my dreams a lot. But this is this is Kukal, the Temple Mount. And it's a place I've been coming to for so many years. And it's the one area of the Palani Hills where you still get a grassland shola habitat. And recently, about maybe 4 years ago, we went there and we've been really thrilled to find populations of Nilgiri tar, right? The mountain goats up here, which have been, you know, virtually hunted into oblivion in the Palani Hills. But there are still populations out in this area. Of course, this is on the border with the Anomalais. This becomes the Anomalais Tiger Reserve after. And these peaks over here on the left, those are the Anomalais. Okay, now I'm going to share with you some amazing views, historical views of the Palani Hills. And well, in the 1860s, there was a British surveyor that went there and did some sketches. And I think almost everybody in Cody School who went to school in the 1970s may have recalled that in the Yuki, that some of the opening pages were some of these pictures. And these are sketches basically of the hills from that time. He went through the hills and sketched all these different landscapes. And a summer ago, our family went to London and we were hosted by my cousin Anna. And I had a chance to go to the British Library and I saw the original volumes of sketches. And I actually was able to photograph everything in it. And I'm just giving you a snippet here to sort of like whet your appetites. But I hope to eventually share the rest of these with everybody later on. But Hamilton sketches the Palanis like we've never seen them, or like we will never see them again. And you know, you can see the Nilgiri tar sitting tamely over here. He was actually a hunter. So if there was a tar there, he was probably out shooting it. But anyways, he was also a talented sketcher, and he's given us a view of Pillar Rocks. Well, here's kind of a view. This was taken probably in the 1990s that I took it, of the same view. Not that different, although you can see, right, these in the original picture, you see what became the golf links, the golf course, right? It's all grassy hills. And the original golf course was, of course, on the montane grasslands. They didn't bring in other grasses until later on. But of course, this is all, you know, densely wooded in plantation. Here's another view of his looking at Kukal. It illustrates the fact that Kukal, Pundi, Pumbari, Manavanur, these are old settlements. They predate European settlement in the hills. And, but those of you that know Kukal, here's our famous leech shola. Many of us have had wonderful experiences getting our blood sucked out as we go through that. But it's one of the largest sholas in the whole Palani Hills range. And here's the grassy peaks at the top, Pampalam Malai. And here is perhaps the most amazing picture that I will share with you. And this was also in a Yuki some time ago, but I've taken a picture of it from the British Library archive, and then I've tried to bring out the contrast in it to see it. But basically, this is the lake before, I'm sorry, this is the lake basin before there was a lake, right? And you can see PERUMAL Peak in the background. And if you look over here where my arrow is pointing, you will see the first church in Cody. This is now where the old cemetery is. And you can see some of the first houses, Shelton and Shelton and Sunnyside. And then I'm not really sure if this is Claverack or this is East Hill, or this is maybe Roseneath up here. I haven't figured it all out yet. But it's an amazing view. And it's also, I think, fairly accurate. My guess is that Hamilton was using some kind of, maybe like a camera obscura or something like that to get fairly accurate views in his drawings of that. Anyways, his albums, they're like 3 or 4 albums, and they're filled with these images. The only challenge is the ink on it is very light, so it's really hard to see some of the lines defined. But I'm going to then jump right ahead. Okay, so we're going from the 1860s all the way to 1981, and there's my family, my mother, my brother, and my sister there. And this must have been taken by my father. But the significant thing, some of you will remember this, the 1980s actually, you know, you can see the settlement of Cody is still relatively small. If you look at it now, these are all buildings, and I haven't put those pictures in on this. But PERUMAL, the mountain, doesn't have any eucalyptus on it. There's nothing. And on all the pictures you now see of PERUMAL, it's got like this hairline of eucalyptus on it. And so that's, you know, some of the changes that have happened. In fact, PERUMAL is a place that some of us have suggested would be a great place for ecological restoration to try to bring the grasslands back. They're actually in pretty good shape up here. And the eucalyptus is having a very hard time. They keep having fires here. The soil is thin, and the grassland is still, you know, sort of resilient there. Other places like Pumbari, this is also from 1981. So this is, I mean, in my mind, this is relatively recent. It's not that long ago. But the Pumbari, of course, is an agricultural settlement, very beautiful, with these, you know, the fields around it. And if you look at it nowadays, it's grown a little bit. There's some more colorful houses, pink and purple. And, but what's significant here are these hills behind. Now, some of you would have seen that Nora Mitchell, in the Nora Mitchell collection, there's a picture of hers showing this same view with these same hills. And there was a raging discussion about these grasslands out here. But, you know, here in 1981, basically these areas are pretty much just only they've started to plant here, not being used very much. This was an area that eventually they settled Sri Lankan repatriates. So it was one of the big areas that when the Sri Lankan Civil War sort of broke out, that's where people were going. And people that were there in the mid-1980s when Mr. Beatty was there, this was one of the groups of Sri Lankan refugees that the school was working with. Then places like Gundar Valley, I think all of us have hiked to Gundar Valley. This is one of my father's pictures that I've stitched together. He took 3 pictures like a panorama, and we put them together. What's interesting here is that this, you can see they're clearing the land here, right? The land is being cleared for the first time to make way for plantations. And what they would do is that they would get laborers to come out here, dig up the dirt, right? Dig up the grassland. That meant it was very vulnerable then to erosion when it rained hard. All that topsoil would go off. And they would first plant potatoes. So the first thing was to plant potatoes. And when we were hiking as kids, I remember seeing potato plants, you know, farms all over the place. And it wouldn't be very productive for very long. That would last about maybe 1 or 2 seasons. And then later on, they would be planting eucalyptus, pine, wattle, and whatnot. So if you looked at this view now, it's all completely covered in forest. So this is quite an interesting picture in that way. Now, Gundar has been in the news also lately because the township has a water supply thing going on here. But notice these sholas here. Here are nice sholas. And that actually highlights one of the key points. The sholas were never disturbed in all these efforts to plant the non-native trees. The reason they're planting here is because grasslands were categorized by the forest department and by other, by the government as wasteland. That means that they were looking for opportunities to use it, to utilize it. So we have, the sholas basically are intact. And that's actually been one of the saving graces of the Palani Hills. The sholas are actually in really good health, right? Here's another view. Now, I think this is from Ted Essebeggers, my father's classmate, who sent me these pictures, and then I stitched them together. This is the BERIJAM Lake view, which most of you would have seen as you drive down, you get that view. The shola is right here. This is an edge of Matikatan shola, but there's other sholas here and grasslands. This, of course, has all been carpeted in different, mostly eucalyptus, I think, on this side, but pine and some other trees. And what it highlights is actually that I think this is in the late 1950s. But even if you had gone in the 1960s, I've seen pictures from the 1960s where these same images, we've still got grasslands. And what that illustrates is that the advent of grasslands in this area was actually quite late, right? Quite late in the calendar. Now here's one from Dr. Lon, and this is from Marcus, his son, who shared some of these with me. And what this is showing you is one of the very early efforts to plant eucalyptus on hills. And you can see that these are some of the first maybe crops of eucalyptus coming up. Maybe they've had some that have been culled over here. But otherwise, the grassland is in the process of being transformed from a montane grassland into a plantation. Now I'm just going to highlight some of what makes the ecology of the Palani Hills Sky Island special, right? So let's talk a little bit about that. So the shola grasslands. Now, all of you have heard of that. You always heard about shola, Bombay shola, bear shola, tiger shola, all of these sholas that were named for animals that once lived there near to Kodi, right? So the shola grassland ecology or system now is recognized. And that's why people in the Malais, in the Nilgiris are also studying it, are also have really started to value this system. And at the same time that we are valuing it, we're losing it. And in the Palani Hills, there's very little of this mosaic that is still left. This is in the really extreme west, near to Vandravu in that area, looking into Kerala, right? But you have species like the Nilgiri tar, right? So the Nilgiri tar is an endemic mammal species, only found in the Western Ghats. It's not found here in Sri Lanka, where I live, for example, and there's similar habitat here, but it never made it over here. But it's found on these grassy slopes, and it takes advantage of these cliffs. And one of the joys of the last couple of decades has been to study and to find Nilgiri tar in different places in the Western Ghats and go looking for them. I found them also in the Palani Hills in different areas. Each time has been a thrilling occasion. When I was in Kodi school, we never saw them. We had the tar pin, and that motivated us to hike, but we had no clue what a tar even looked like. Right? And I only saw tar after I graduated from Kodi school and came back. And anyway, so tar are out in this area. There was a time, I mean, Hamilton, the same guy that did those sketches, talked about the old buck of Kodaikanal, right? He was hunting it where Priest Walk is. So we know that from accounts that they were once abundant in Kodi, in that area. There's other interesting species in the Shola, like these Salia lizards. This is a species that, you know, I got in our garden near Bombay Shola, actually, and had a chance to hang on to it for a little while, kept it as a pet overnight, photographed it, and then let it go again. But it's a really rare lizard, only found in some of these upper, you know, in the Sky Island habitats, very limited range. But if you live in Kodi and you have a garden up there, there's a good chance you might get these lizards there. And then there's species like the Nilgiri pipit, which is endemic also to the southern Western Ghats, and it's a grassland bird. So it is evolved around grasslands, and it has adapted itself to that. And you find it in the Nilgiris, of course. You find it here in this area, the Palani's high range, that area. All right, so let's talk a little bit about some of those changes and what's happened. This change is a big theme that we want to discuss here. Well, so one of the interesting things I do as a geography teacher is that in the last 15 years or so, since I moved to Sri Lanka, I became interested in geographic information systems. And I think behind it all was I really wanted to explore the places, the hills that I loved through maps. I've always loved maps, and I was frustrated that I couldn't always get maps, so I decided I'm going to start making my own maps and, you know, seeing what kind of data is out there. So one of the interesting things that I was able to discover after learning some of the basic skills was some of the Landsat images. And the Landsat program run by the US government, so if you're a US government taxpayer, this has been a great investment of your money. They have been taking all these pictures of the Earth. And about 10 years ago, they made their whole archive freely available to all of us. And it's not made available in this form. It's made available in raw images that you need to go into and process, and it takes a lot of time. And that's how I would spend many of my weekends when I couldn't do other things. I would go and work on some of these images. And this has been one of the most interesting images that I sort of came across in their archive, and that is this flight over South India in 1973. Now think about it. Some of you in this, I'm looking at the names. I mean, some of you are from like the 70s, right? Some of you may have even been in Kodi in February 1973 when this image was made, right? And we're now using these images. Image by itself, I find by itself is beautiful, and that's why I've made this nice little sort of map of it to show you. And if you go into my blog, you can go in and download a nice A3 version, and you can go in and explore it a little bit more. But it's also being used to analyze the land cover and the vegetation in more detail. And that's what's really exciting. And so a couple of years ago, I guess it was 2014 when I really started processing these. And I had this idea of, well, what if we looked at some of the old images and then compared it to new images? And this is common practice in GIS, doing change analysis, where you're looking at a given area and you look at how it's changed. And most, you know, this is the kind of thing they've been doing in the Amazon rainforest to look at deforestation and those kinds of things. And it's stunning, and it's shocking, right? Some of those differences when you see, say, the Amazon or Borneo as the forest shrinks. In our case, the Palani Hills is a little bit different. It's not that forest is shrinking. What we see here is that grassland is shrinking. And that is kind of a complicated issue. But here's our area, the Palani Hills, our study area. And what you can see is this light purple are our grassland areas, going out to BERIJAM from BERIJAM Lake, going out here. The red pockets are either shola or plantation. It's very hard to distinguish between which one is which, because these images are coarse. And this is 1973. I was 3 years old when this image was taken, right? So the technology at that time was really pretty basic. But take a look over here at ERAVIKULAM, this place that I've been telling you a little bit about. You can see the grasslands here. This yellow line, of course, is a border between Kerala and Tamil Nadu. MALAI is also there. Grasslands looking pretty good in this. But you can see these are the grasslands here. If you look at where my arrow is, that is those ones across from Pumbari that I was telling you about. That in 1980 were still grassland, all right? Now notice, by the way, I'm focusing in this talk really on the upper Palani Hills. And I wanted to be really clear about that because the Palani Hills is a big area. There's lower slopes, there's the eastern side. And I'm really talking about this area between Kodi and Bandarvu, all right? That's the area I'm focusing on in this study. So in 2014, when I was doing this analysis, the preliminary analysis, I was looking at it. This was the image that I was able to get out, the most recent one. I think it was Landsat 8. Yeah, it was Landsat 8, which had just gone up. It was when it was orbiting at that time. It was brand new at the time. So it's a high resolution image. And this version I'm giving you is not so good right now. But what you can see is this dense red. So this is a false, like the other one, it's a false color image. That dense red, basically this whole mass is what we can be pretty sure is mostly plantation. It's got sholas mixed in with it, but it's largely plantation. So it shows and demonstrates this huge land cover change in that time. Right, so I had done that I looked at these and I made a blog post on it. That was a lot of fun. That's the kind of thing I do. I met some of other scientists at a meeting. We had a symposium in Kodi in I think about 2016. No, it was earlier. It was early, maybe it was 2014. It was about the same time I did these images. And we invited friends from different parts, from the forest department, to come up and talk about plantations. The symposium was on plantations and how to understand plantations better. So Bob and Tanya played a key role in that. And a team was set up basically to study this change, to quantify the changes that I had shown in that blog post. So we had some really talented people that knew how to use GIS better than I do. And ARSUMANI, the key investigator here, supported by Robin and Danish, and there's a team of us, went in and analyzed that data more. And they basically simplified it to show you these colors of what the land cover is. And clearly you can see from 1973, this light green, the Shola grassland, and that quickly, you know, over the years, 1981, then to 1993, you can see it starts to shrink in 2003. And then by 2014, we have the Shola grassland has shrunk, mainly because of timber plantations, but also note that agricultural and fallow lands have expanded too. Now this article, if you want to read it, is all online. It's a fascinating study about an area that you are all familiar with. So as part of that whole effort, before we published it, there was a team up in Kodi, and Danish, the guy there with the phone in his hand, was charged with going out and doing some of the ground truthing. So ground truthing is where you go out and you take a GPS position of a place and you say, aha, this is a pine plantation, and you log it in, or this is a grassland. And so they went around Kodi and did, you know, they went around to different places. They had full support of the forest department in this study. So sometimes we had teams of us going out. In this case, these pictures were taken on a trip where I led the group out to Ibex Peak, one of the second highest peak actually in the Palani Hills, where there are still some last bits of grassland left. But you can see the grassland we found was in such small pockets. It was in areas where the land, the soil was very shallow, and where the trees basically couldn't take root. It was on the edge of cliffs, as you can see over here in the upper right? That's up near Ibex Peak. But you can see this grassland is quickly disappearing. And it's significant because I've been coming here I came here with the DeYoungs, I came here with my father, I've been coming here in the 1990s and then basically the last 30 years. And what we're seeing is this spread of these trees right up to the cliffs and even over the edge of the cliffs is really dramatic. And you will see later on, one of our recommendations from that study was that to really protect these areas, to get teams out there and try to at least protect some of these edge grasslands. This is prime Nilgiri tar, Nilgiri pipit habitat. And because they were never intended, you can see the Forest Department actually planted the plantations back further. They did not plan to have this planted with plantation. They actually had fire lines here. They were actually walking through a fire line here. But the plantation has jumped from where it was originally intended. Anyways, that's a challenge that they faced. Let's go on. Now, in quantifying it also in the study, you can actually see in terms of the numbers, like in terms of percentage cover, what happened, right? So here we have grassland shola in 1973 at a little bit, maybe, I don't know, 68%, something, I can't remember what the numbers are, and then going all the way down to like 20% or whatever. So that's really dramatic. And it's, you know, all of you watching Coady alumni, what occurs to me is that, man, this happened right under our noses. It happened while we were in Coady School, while we were students or teachers there, you know, blissfully hiking in the hills without being aware that the place that we loved was actually being changed really dramatically. All right, so let me talk now about the idea of the Sky Island, all right? And this is kind of some of the key points. So this idea of the Sky Island has come about recently. I was looking in some of my writing, and it goes back to 2012 when I first cited the idea. So we've been talking about it for the last 8 years, but it is an idea basically whose time has come. And to me, it helps us understand this very special home that we have in Coady, right? All of us have an association with Coady of love, I think. And it seems to say something really special about this place, something that we haven't been able to maybe articulate before. And that's the way I feel about it. But the idea of the Sky Island actually comes from North America. It comes from Arizona, I think, where it was in the 1940s when they first came up with it, right? And that was to identify areas, isolated mountain ranges that are really different from the areas around it. But think about it. That's exactly what, you know, when we think about Coady, we think about the Palani Hills, that's what it is. It's an area so different from everything else around it. I think most of us, one of the experiences that we've had, if you grew up in India and grew up in Coady and then you went anywhere else in the world and you tried to explain to them like where you had grown up, it was always such a struggle, right? It was a struggle because you couldn't explain to people like where you had been, that strange place, Coady up in the hills of South India, that it was actually freezing in the winter at times, and that you were in, you know, near the equator and, you know, whatever else. And then it's, so for me, the Sky Island helps me to sort of articulate that specialness of what the Palani Hills is, right? And it's not just the Palani Hills, it's also our neighboring range, the high range over in Kerala. It's the Nilgiris up north of the Palghat Gap, some of the hill ranges to the south of us. It's the areas here in Sri Lanka, the Central Highlands. These are all Sky Islands, and they're really special places. But for us in the Coady community, I think my feeling is that, you know, it's a really exciting idea to bring in the idea of Sky Islands. Now, I don't take credit for this at all. There are a lot of other people that were involved in it. And some of the key people that were involved in us better understanding it were the late Bob Stewart and Tanya BALCAR. These are two of my good friends. Bob passed away earlier this year. It's really sad. We miss him a lot, and his wife Tanya passed away 4 years ago. But these two individuals did a great deal for us to contribute to our understanding of the hills. They started off basically as concerned citizens, working to make sure that people weren't cutting sholas. They learned how to propagate sholas. They studied sholas. They worked with K.M. Matthew, who was at Chembaganur at the time, and they grew. And in that, their knowledge also grew because they started off with a bare understanding, and yet now we recognize them as some of the most knowledgeable people that there were on the Shola grassland system. And there were several things that they did that were significant, but one of the key things was they experimented with restoring grasslands. So they actually made an attempt to restore grasslands. How is it possible for us to restore grasslands? And there's a blog post I've written on that. You can look at that. Basically, in a nutshell, it's really tough. It's really, really tough. Bob, I remember saying, look, it's virtually useless to try to restore grasslands. But Vasant, who's on this call with us, is in the Nilgiris pushing ahead with a project where they are working on restoring grasslands using some of Bob and Tanya's ideas. So really exciting on that idea, but certainly recognizing the value of grasslands, all right? Both for the biodiversity and the hydrology of it. But it was also Bob and Tanya that made that observation that sholas were coming up in plantations. Now here we've been talking about plantations as being, you know, such negative aspects of the ecology, and Bob comes out and says, wait a minute, you know, there's actually sholas regenerating in some of these plantations. And that has brought in a really interesting twist to the whole story. They were also, of course, linked in with other important conservation organizations. So the Nature Conservation Foundation that's based in Mysore and Valparai, right? They worked with them, right? That's with Divya and Sridhar and their group. With Gurukula, right? Botanical Garden in Wayanad. I got a chance to visit there with them. And then they've been working with IISER in Tirupati, right? And they also worked with the Tamil Nadu and Kerala Forest Department. So there's a lot of collaborative work that went into that. One of the challenges that we now, those of us, the friends of Bob and Tanya, face is how to ensure that their legacy continues some of what they've done. And that's something that we're working on right now. Now, another important person is my friend Robin Vijayan. Now, he is really sort of the father of the idea of the Western Ghats biodiversity hotspot as Sky Islands. He, more than anybody else, has brought this idea to our popular attention. And he's an assistant professor, right? But he is also mentoring a whole group of other research scientists based in Tirupati, but coming up to some of the hill ranges where they're conducting long-term studies. His main studies have been about birds, about the shortwing, the Sholicola, about the Nilgiri pipit, about other species that are specific to the Sky Islands. So check out his work at the Shola Sky Islands website, right? It's a great place to see some of the interesting things they're doing. Now, I should just mention that KIS, right, the school has a relationship with Robin. I've been able to hook them up. And Robin's team has been based out of one of the school dormitories, and they're doing long-term studies in Bombay Shola. And so they've made all kinds of interesting observations of birds right there, nesting right in one of the dormitories in Claverack, I think, right, of a shortwing nesting right there. And, you know, feeding behavior, all kinds of things they're looking at. So this is one of the relationships that we want to build in the future, right, with Robin and his team. Just a couple of notes about some of the indicator species, because when we look at the map of South India, we want to look at like where species are. And I don't have maps for all my species, but rhododendrons, right, which I think everybody knows from their hikes in the hills, they were in flower usually, you know, in the winter months, like December to February, but also at other times. You know, these are Sky Island species. And you can see that on this map here, the distribution map is showing in the Nilgiris and then the Palani and MALAI's high range block. And I would be really curious if anybody has ever seen them down further south. But if you go down further south of these ranges, it's not, you don't get peaks that are above 1,800 meters, right? In the high wavy mountains or down here in Agastya Malai in these areas. Now, I've been to some of these areas, but I'd like to actually go back and look more closely for rhododendrons. It's a species you can't miss. And it's you know, a really significant one for us in Kodi. There's even some of them, when you walk around the lake, if you look carefully, there's a couple of them trying to grow out of one of the areas where there was a wall there. And they're still there, sort of remnants of our, you know, grassland shola habitat. So this is a Sholicola. This is what used to be known as the white-bellied shortwing. I still call it that. I shouldn't. It's now the white-bellied blue robin, right? And so it's been split. The species has been split. There are now 3 species where there used to be 1, which is quite exciting for bird watchers. It means that we have to work harder now if we want to see all 3 of them. I think I've seen 2, but I haven't seen the one in the far south. Interesting. This is, I mean, it is a blue robin, and it was the main study has been done by Robin Vijayan. All right, and it's a wonderful coincidence that his name and the bird that he studied so much are the same thing, right? But if you are walking in Bombay Shola, this is one of the birds you need to look out for. It's pretty shy, but sometimes you will see it singing in about March or April. I've been there when it's singing, and I've seen this bird on the school compound. I've seen it on Lock End. I've seen it up at Jaffna House. It's a cute little bird. I get excited every time it flies across. Now, I'm going to wrap up a little bit with just talking a little bit about what the school has done. And if I made a blog post to go with this, and I highlight some of the details of it. But one of the exciting things, at Coady School is that they have set up this center, right? The Center for Environment and Humanity. And this was done, I think last September it was inaugurated. And it's a project that took, I think, many years. It goes back to, I would credit probably Paul Wiebe and generations before, looking at trying to sort of promote environmental education. But this project, definitely the energy of Clarence Maloney, who spoke just a little while ago to us about all the great initiatives they're doing. He's been sort of the engine behind this, you know, pushing everybody to get things done, being rather impatient with all of us about it. So we owe him some gratitude, serious gratitude for actually getting it off the ground. And you will recognize that it's at the Swedish Hill, at the dormitory up there, which is such an amazing place actually for a research center, because it is still within the Coady bounds, our boundary, but it is right there next to Bombay Shola. It's on the way as people go out to Pillar Rocks and the 10 Mile Round and all of those locations, they pass by it. And of course, for many Coady School people, there's an old connection of the Swedish dorm. And if you were maybe we have Swedish students that were once there when it was part of the Swedish school, you know, there's a wonderful history there. So Clarence was a force of energy, but Corey Stixrud, our principal, right, at Coady School, has then pushed and facilitated it. And then I should mention Ashwin Fernandez, also the facilities manager. He's been really crucial in sort of getting teams up there to make it look good in a way that only Coady School can do, the way those teams work and put the finishing touches on things. Also, the housing group has done that. But basically, it's the idea of the center is still evolving. We are still working with it. Oh yeah, Coady, I just want to also acknowledge Coady Friends International, which I think provided some of the funding for this to get off the ground. And it's been a great thing, I think, for alumni to get involved in. But basically the center, the idea is it's got, you know, teaching spaces, it's got exhibition spaces, it's got rooms if you've got student groups coming up there. The idea is that maybe you'll get university groups coming up there to stay, or maybe even like Coady School students go up there and do a retreat and learn about things. And the people managing it right now are Raja Manikam and Lakshmi, and you can see their baby over there in the corner, right? So they've been the ones that have been running all these amazing programs. And you would have heard it if you saw our talk a week or 2 ago. They were speaking at that and telling you all about the really amazing things they're doing. And I mean, I think one of the things that they bring that's really strong to it is this sort of grassroots connection. And they've been able to connect with the forest department, with the local schools. And the center is providing this really important space, something that Coady has not had before. So I think this is just the beginning of it. And it's a really exciting initiative, I would say. Yeah, so I'm just gonna write a couple sub points. This is me being a teacher, I'm sorry about that. But you know, I mean, for Coady School, the things that we need to do, right? We need to sort of acknowledge the uniqueness, of the Palani Hills, the Sky Islands. What I'm trying to do is get the school and get all the, you know, the key people to like tap into this idea of the Sky Islands. It is something that has power and has something that we can sort of, like a branding power, my wife who's sitting behind me will remind me about, right? And it's something we need. Other schools, notably like Woodstock up in, you know, Himalayas, all they have to do is say Himalayas, and you know, people like, they perk up. So my argument on this is that we've got the Sky Islands, and that's a really special thing to sort of market and brand ourselves with. So we need to, you know, to continue to promote environmental and experiential education, as well as local outreach. Now, Cody School does a lot of different things, right? And I'm on the board of the school, and I realize how hard the faculty works. I realize, you know, of course, right now they're in a really difficult situation with the COVID situation. I realize that Cody School is many different things for different people. But for me, I really feel that environmental and experiential education is the future. And that, you know, as a school, it's important for us to embrace this, to distinguish us also from all the other IB schools that are out there in India, right? It's one of the key things that can distinguish us, right? We're looking also to make links with higher education institutions around the world. And that's something that Corey is already, they're well onto this. And they've got links set up. The COVID problem is, you know, probably delayed this a little bit, but that's one of the exciting possibilities. And eventually we need to look at raising awareness of tourists and to a lesser extent residents about some of the ecological issues. But that's been one of the big challenges, is how to manage the unmanageable tourism in Cody. And that's just an issue. I'm not saying that necessarily needs to be in the mission, but it's something we need to think about. In terms of the hills and where we're going, you know, from our study, based on that study, we realized that we needed to identify and conserve montane grasslands in the Palani Hills. From our maps, we pretty much know where they are, but we now need to really work on protecting those. You can see the grasslands in the picture below. This is, you know, near the city view on the way over to from Shembaganur. And this is the, you know, the kind of thing you see, right? You know, here you have montane grasslands. People are trashing it, right? They leave all their waste there. That's a problem around the world. We have it in Sri Lanka. We have it in other places. It's not unique to the Palani Hills, but it's an issue. So we need to check the invasion of sparsely invaded grasslands. So these are grasslands where there's just the beginnings of invasion of non-native species coming in. That's a key thing we need to work on. And that takes, you know, that takes labor. It's like labor intensive. But, you know, that's something that we've got volunteers for. We've got people that need jobs. I mean, what better to do than to go out and restore some of these areas? Agriculture is a bit tricky, right? These are livelihoods and people's jobs, and it's the food supply and whatnot. But perhaps, you know, putting some kind of cap on how far agriculture goes, or certainly having conversations with the farmers and people involved in that sector about it, planning it. Managing tourism, I've talked a little bit about that. The whole way that flows and develops and is an issue. And that, of course, raising awareness about them, which I talked about. Well, there's my works cited at the end. I'm a good teacher. I'm not sure if that's everything there, but that is basically my presentation.
Ian, I've got a question.
Shoot.
When I was last there in Cody in 2001, the concern was Cody Lake, and it was silted in. You could almost walk across without going underwater. What's happened to the lake now?
Cody Lake is there. They were talking about dredging it. You know, part of the problem is, I mean, if there's land use on the edges of it where they're like, say, building, right, then there you get runoff into the lake. I don't know if that move to dredge it has where that has gone. Some of the edges of the lake are experiencing development where there probably shouldn't be development. People building houses. The area is getting crowded. I think one of the biggest issues is there is a master plan for Cody. And this was in the news a little while ago, which basically determines where you build things and where you can and can't. And one of the problems is that master plan has been ignored for long periods of time. And so, you know, just sort of following the master plan might be a good start, but that's easier said than done. But the lake, I would say at this point, it's there. You know, it's such a key part of the Cody experience, right? Everybody that goes to Cody walks around the lake, goes boating on the lake. It's a key part. You want to keep it healthy. Some of you would have gone swimming in it in the 1960s and 70s. I remember hearing stories about that. By the time I got
the 40s
there,
and 50s.
yeah, okay, 40, yeah, going back. By the time I got there, we didn't want to go swimming in it. It was pretty gnarly.
Invasive plant.
Oh,
Very far from the lake.
Yeah, there probably are. I mean, there's like, I don't know if it's like water hyacinth or what's in there. I wouldn't be surprised if there are invasives. I don't think it's as such a big issue. I mean, even any of the fish basically in the lake would have been introduced from outside. I don't think that's such a big issue right now. One of the things though is to make sure it's clean, because there are downstream communities that are depending on the lake, and the water supply is really important. The water in the lake, I think where the contamination comes is downstream of it.
I can make a comment if you like.
Yes, Clarence?
There is something in the lake. It came from Brazil, and it is proliferating all around the lake and even down to the bottom. And internationally, it's a terrible problem. And they are trying to scoop it out, but it is continuing. It's a new thing. You might not have seen it, Ian. Okay. So this is a big problem. And the other thing is the pollution. There is no sewer system around the lake. The hundreds or thousands of people living around the lake, their sewage all goes into the lake. And there has been a budget for the sewer system around the lake, but then they have to make a sewage treatment plant, and that's too expensive. So these are the problems about the lake. But right now, with the good monsoon, it's full of water.
Could I ask a question about the wildlife? I don't know what's.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, so what's the trend? What's the trend now with, for example, the elephant population in the hills? And I mean, I know that the gaur has been coming into town, and but maybe more specifically, what about out in the hills? Is the population of wildlife growing or shrinking, or?
Okay, yeah, that's a good question, Louise, thanks. The wildlife situation, from what I know, is very interesting. Okay, that is, you have this spike in the populations of gaur, right? The bison, Indian bison, right? That, when I was a student, like seeing them was pretty rare. We got excited when we saw a gaur out there. Now you hang around 7 roads in the middle of the night, or even sometimes in the middle of the day, and a gaur or a herd of them will come walking by. Now, the suggestion would be that, they've lost their habitat out in the hills, and then they're being forced into the city. There have not been any really good studies that I think we can cite on this yet. It is a question that really needs to be answered. I mean, look, they might like the grass that grows in Cody better than the grass that grows outside, in the sense that the grass growing in Cody is all this non-native stuff that we grow on like flag green and whatnot, right? It's like on Bendy Field, that really wonderful Cody grass, that's not native to Cody, right? And I mean, that they tend to like that. But at the same time, we know their habitat is, where there were grasslands out there, right? It's been densely forested. The reasons we don't know it is that there's nobody, as far as I know, conducting real studies on the movement of the gaur, of their presence out in some of these remote areas. And one of the big challenges right now is that people aren't getting to those areas that we used to go to on hikes, right? So when we were hiking in those days, you have a sense of what's going on out in Bandarvu or out in Kukal or these places. And I'm not sure the extent to which we really know what's going on out there. Now, populations like elephants are in the lower hills usually, and I mean, you hear about it mainly from farmers where there's maybe some conflict with elephants, like that Palangi Valley, deep down from Palangi, but more like the Palani Valley also on the other side, Bilagabi, and going down there, I think. That's Petupari, that place, I'm trying to remember all my names now, of those areas that have, you know, elephant populations. But what's interesting is that, see, Kodi is now, and Kodi is also, I didn't mention this in the show, but we've now got the Kodaikanal Wildlife Sanctuary, right? That sanctuary now covers most of the area I was talking about. That from going from the golf course all the way out to Vandarbu is now a sanctuary. But it's a sanctuary which not many people are going into, and we don't, you know, the access, they haven't really quite figured out, as far as I know, like what to do with it. Like, how do you deal with plantations in the sanctuary? Usually in India, there are very strict rules about any kind of cutting in a sanctuary. You would never allow cutting in a sanctuary. And yet here, maybe that's just what they might need. But I mean, Bob Stewart would say, no, we don't need cutting. Just let the Shola basically come back. It will take over things.
Ian, I really liked your presentation. Thanks so much. It's been really good. I have a question about the plantations and ownership of that land, and who plants, who manages, who harvests, who benefits from those plantations.
Okay, so good question. I mean, the plantations were, of course, I mean, it was all under the jurisdiction of the Forest Department, right? The Forest Department had that jurisdiction. In fact, one of the arguments that they put in, I remember wondering, like in the 1990s, they were planting right by Dolphin's Nose. You walk down to Dolphin's Nose in the 1990s, it was all grassland. You go down there now, there's no view off Dolphin's Nose practically, because the eucalyptus trees have come up around it. So I wondered, in those years, which seemed, we knew then that grasslands were endangered, why were they planting? And somebody pointed out to me that one reason they might have been planting was to ensure there wasn't encroachment there. By putting a tree plantation there, they could say, look, there's a plantation, you're not allowed to encroach. Where it was very difficult with grasslands, if people encroached into that, to be able to evict people or, you know, that kind of thing. So it's under the jurisdiction of the Forest Department, but in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, those were being managed. So people were coming in, you know, their trucks going out there, they were cutting them and then planting them again, those kinds of things. That has pretty much stopped. And I'm not up to date on all the latest of what that is, but because it's a sanctuary, they've stopped that. So in other words, you're getting those eucalyptus trees that are maturing out there. Originally, I think when they were planted, they would have, you know, after 10 years or 15 years, they would have harvested them and then moved them out, planted again. Now those trees will mature. And this is where the interesting thing comes in. If Shola are actually sort of regenerating in some of these plantations, it's, you know, in 100 years, what's going to be there? Are we going to actually have, like, and that's in some of my writing, I've always said that we've got like a hybrid ecosystem in Kodi. That is, we've got the Shola grassland mosaic, that ecosystem, then mixed in with plantations of these different species, and then this kind of hybrid that's coming out of it. And that's not such a bad thing. I don't want to put a value judgment on it. That's just the way it is. All right. That's what's happening right now. And you know, we sort of have to manage that situation.
Question about firewood. Is that managed well, or how does it work?
So
collecting of firewood.
Yeah, and I can ask maybe Clarence to give me some feedback on this later on. But I mean, you will still, firewood, they're allowed to bring in certain amounts of firewood into the township of Kodi, which are used for fuel needs, for people's needs, right? And in fact, you know, it could be argued that without plantations also, you know, if we didn't have plantations, had they not introduced, the British introduced like the eucalyptus trees in the late 19th century, there would be no Sholas in Kodi, right? It was Zai Whitaker that pointed that out to me. She said, you know, look, the plantations in some ways helped save the Sholas in Kodi, right? That without them, you wouldn't have had the fuel wood because it's cold up there, people need a fuel source. So the plantations basically serve that purpose. Now, I'm not up to date on what the latest sort of management, how they manage that. And it's an interesting, I mean, it's something, this is the kind of thing where you need researchers in Kodi to study that dynamic. Because there's also a social dynamic, like the women that carry those headloads that, you know, I remember seeing, and, you know, I remember at an assembly at some point, we had, I'm looking at Peter and Lynn, you guys were probably there, but there was an assembly where we brought in a head load to school, a woman's head load. And we had to estimate, like, how heavy do you think this is? And, you know, can you carry it? And it was really, it helped us, I think, as students sort of appreciate, you know, the hard work that some of these women, it was all women going out there. And to this, I'm pretty sure you still see them going up and down, you know, collecting firewood that way.
Ian, I'm remembering a CE when we tried to carry a head load. It was amazing. And then we had a small head load. I think it weighed at least 100 pounds. It was incredible.
Yeah, yeah, it's.
What about the ibex?
To BERIJAM Lake. Is that still a reservoir?
Yeah, let me talk about ibex or tar, and then I'll talk about BERIJAM. The Nilgiri tar populations, since the areas have been better protected, I think are on a rebound. And so it is, you can, well, there are places that you can find them. It's tricky. It's not like, if you go over to Munnar in Kerala and you go to ERAVIKULAM National Park, there's a so-called tourist zone where you will see them up close and personal. But to see them in the Palanis is still something very special because they're skittish, they're scared of humans, and they're an amazing goat when you watch them sort of, you know, bouncing across the cliffs. I don't know what the latest population estimates are, but the World Wildlife Fund did a census about 5 or 6 years ago that is online, where they made some estimates of numbers. But in the places that Cody School goes hiking right now, I think it's pretty hard to see them. Meaning you need to get permission to go into areas that are now very difficult to get to. Now, on the idea of BERIJAM, sorry, I'm just running along, but on the idea of BERIJAM Lake, I mean, the lake is still there. They were allowing tourists like 50 vehicles a day to go in there. And they were basically stopping them at Moyers Point, and then if you got a pass, you could go in. And a couple of years ago, I went out with Bob and Tanya, and I realized why they had those gates there. Because the gates used to really annoy me, because they would prevent me in the last 20 years from going to places that I loved and I wanted to get to early in the morning. But those gates on a regular day when there's tourists there are just a madhouse. You've got lots and lots of people. You've got vendors selling corn. You've got monkeys coming to take corn from people. You've got tea shops. It was a bit of a circus. And so those gates, unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, they served a purpose, I suppose, in trying to restrict people into the more sensitive areas of the Palani Hills. I mean, the challenge is, of course, now everybody's got a car or a motorcycle, right? So you're more mobile. All the visitors coming to Cody are more mobile. Every Cody school teacher has a car now, right? People don't walk. People are scared to walk because they're going to get run over or something. I mean, that's crazy, right? And so it's changed the nature of a place that we used to, you know, so closely associate with walking. And the government has not been able to restrict like areas so that you have areas that are car free. That has been done in a few other Indian hill stations, like Matharan near Bombay. But in Cody, they've never been able to do it. And they just, you know, it's really hard to manage vehicular traffic. My feeling is if you could put a cap on where vehicles can go to and then have people walk and say, if you want to walk, go. Otherwise, stay here. Or, you know, here's an area where you can see, you know, if you're not mobile, if you need to be in a wheelchair or something like that or whatever. But the car issue is a big challenge.
Ian, my question's kind of buried in there. Mona from Class 83. So thank you for that excellent historic overview of the Palani Hills. It was so informative. I have a question about some of the names, like BERIJAM, Marian Shola, Devil's Kitchen, and so on. I noticed that some of these have Tamil names, some of which I wasn't even aware of, like BERIJAM is Mati Kitan. Am I saying that right?
Mati Kitan, yeah. Yeah.
So which came first? I mean, was that name always there, and the British and Americans just called it BERIJAM, or how does it? Do you know anything about the naming?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure if I have. Thanks, Mona. Thanks for your question. I'm not sure if I have an answer, but BERIJAM, you know, when Hamilton's one of the first guys that goes there, first people to document, not first people ever, but he's one of the first people to actually document visiting BERIJAM. And if you look at the survey maps, which Dave Dickinson was talking about, if you look at the 1 to 50,000 map, there's a place called Fort Hamilton on there. And when I was a kid, when we were in school, I looked at those survey maps and I was like, what? There's a fort in BERIJAM? What is this? And we actually went out there looking for this bloody fort, right? On one of those class camps, actually with Alfred Pickard. He was on that trip. And we went looking for this fort. There's no fort out there, but there's an interesting story to it, right? And I don't know where the name BERIJAM came from because it goes back there. But Hamilton wrote a report, and that is online. If you look for that, that's online. And in the report, Cody had, this is 1860 something. And he was like, Cody, it's not a bad place, Kodaikanal, but really where you want to be is in BERIJAM. That's where you should build your sanatorium. So he had this idea of like building a sanatorium for the military where you bring all your soldiers and let them like cool down up there and, you know, like recover from their sickness. And I think Fort Hamilton is the place that he had pegged as the ideal place for this new settlement, which thankfully never happened.
We've gone past an hour and a half here, so anybody who wants to stay on and chat, that's fine. Thank you, Ian, very much.